Great. In 8 or 10 minutes, I'm going to try and talk about 4 things. First, while it might have been debatable a few years ago, I think most people would agree now that this intervention was a disaster. And so I'll sort of go through some of the reasons why and how it was a disaster. That'll be number one. And secondly, I'll ask the question, how could we have done something so stupid? Third, I'll explore what would have happened if we had not launched this military intervention. And then lastly, I'll look at what are the lessons of Libya for the future of U.S. foreign policy. So first of all, why do I say that this intervention was a disaster? Well, it was a disaster both for the Libyans and for our interests. For Libya, it was a disaster by a slew of metrics. So first of all, in terms of deaths, there were about 1,000 deaths in Libya from this conflict. Is the mic not on? Yeah. Can you hear me now? Hello? Okay. So what are the metrics that make me say that this was a disaster for Libyans? Well, first of all, there were, in terms of deaths, there were about 1,000 deaths from the conflict before we intervened, and the deaths were coming to an end at that point. Since our intervention, there have been over 10,000 deaths, so the death toll increased by at least a factor of 10. In terms of the length of the conflict, as I say, when we intervened, it had been going on for about a month. It was going to end in about another week or two if we hadn't intervened, so it would have been about a 6-week civil war. And instead, we got a war that is still going on after more than 4 years. Libya may have had many faults, indeed had many faults, prior to our intervention, but there was a degree of order in society, and today there is not. Today there is anarchy. In terms of the Islamist threat, it was contained by Gaddafi prior to our intervention. There were some Islamists in the northeast, but they were contained. They were not causing trouble. There was no safe haven. Today there is a safe haven for terrorism in Libya that's killing Christians, foreigners, and others. The economy, Libya had by all measures, the best economy in all of Africa prior to the intervention. Today, there is no electricity in the cities of Libya for most of the day. Human rights violations, there were certainly some under Gaddafi, but they pale compared to what we've had since the intervention, where we've had ethnic cleansing of tens of thousands of black Africans, assassination of liberals, and so forth. So a disaster for Libya, but also a disaster for the U.S. and the rest of the world, this intervention. We took a country that was an ally in the global war on terror, and we turned it into a terrorist safe haven, not only for al-Qaeda, but today also for ISIS. These Islamists killed our ambassador and 3 other Americans. They was a training ground for the recent attacks in Tunisia, and many more threats. In addition, the intervention caused a spillover of war to Mali, which became a new safe haven for al-Qaeda, requiring a French intervention. There was proliferation of weapons from Gaddafi's arsenal as a result of our intervention. Thousands of surface-to-air missiles leaked out. One of them was fired out of the Gaza Strip against an Israeli aircraft. Another one shot down an aircraft in the Sinai Desert. Our nuclear non-proliferation policy was undermined because Gaddafi had actually given up his nuclear weapons, and his reward for giving up his nuclear weapons was to be overthrown, tortured, and killed. So anybody who's thinking about giving up their nuclear weapons is now going to think twice. And in fact, both North Korea and Iran said, aha, look at this. This is why you should not give up your nuclear program, because you'll wind up like Gaddafi. And then in addition, the rewarding of militants in Libya, NATO's rewarding of militants in Libya, encouraged militants elsewhere to resort to rebellion. So that in Syria, we saw a peaceful uprising turn into a violent uprising, and that is when the death toll spiked. So those are some of the metrics which show that this was a disaster, both for Libya and for us and our allies. So the second question is, why did we do something so stupid? And I think there are at least 4 reasons. First of all, there was propaganda from the rebels, which claimed, hey, we are really having a peaceful uprising and Gaddafi is responding with genocide. Neither of those was true. It was not a peaceful uprising. It was an armed uprising, and Gaddafi was responding by targeting the militants, not by targeting civilians. But that was the rebel propaganda, and I think it had an audience in the White House. And so we saw both Samantha Power and Susan Rice embrace this narrative. They seem to have persuaded Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State. She seems to have persuaded Barack Obama that, in fact, there was an impending genocide in Libya that only U.S. intervention could stop. There was also propaganda that there was a united opposition to Gaddafi, and that therefore this would be very easy, that we would intervene and just help the vast majority of the Libyan people who wanted to overthrow Gaddafi. In fact, it wasn't that simple. Gaddafi had a lot of support, and the rebels were quite divided. Third, we, the United States, tends not to understand deeply divided societies. We talk about the Libyans, the Iraqis, and in fact, there is no one group called the Iraqis. As we found out, there are Shiites, there are Sunni, there are Kurds. Similarly, in Libya, there was a greatly fractured society along many lines, including tribal lines, and we didn't appreciate that. And then I think there was a failure to learn that, Gaddafi of 2011 was not Gaddafi of the 1980s, that he had turned from a supporter of terrorism to our ally in the war on terror. But people had formed opinions, I think, a long time ago that he was this mad dog. Anyway, those are some of the reasons we did something so stupid. What would have happened if we hadn't intervened militarily? Well, first of all, there would not have been a bloodbath. You may hear talk today, oh, there would have been a bloodbath in Benghazi, the last city that the rebels controlled and that was about to be taken by Gaddafi. But there had not been a bloodbath in any of the cities that Gaddafi had retaken from the rebels. So why would there have been a bloodbath in the last city that Gaddafi was about to retake? There would not have been. It was not his strategy. His strategy, in fact, was to let the rebels escape. He encouraged them to escape. He let them escape from all the other towns that he had recaptured. And he didn't want to turn the people against them, so he wasn't going to commit a bloodbath against the people. If we hadn't intervened militarily, what would have happened politically in Libya? Well, there was a decent chance that in fairly short order, if we had done nothing, that Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Gaddafi, would have come to power relatively soon. Gaddafi was old, he was sick, and Saif was the most likely, although not the certain inheritor, but the most likely. Now, was he a Jeffersonian Democrat? No, he was not. He was, however, a very serious reformist. He said that many times that he would not come to power unless there were a new constitution and democracy and economic reform and so forth. And he paid a price for taking that stand. It was not just cheap talk. Now, some people will say, well, he gave this mean speech after the rebellion started, so therefore it shows he was never a reformer. Well, if you have rebels trying to overthrow you and kill you, you probably give a mean speech too. It doesn't mean that if you inherited power, that you wouldn't live up to all the things that you had been saying you would do and paying a price for doing in terms of reform. I think he was quite seriously a reformer. Moreover, what if we hadn't intervened militarily, but we had engaged in negotiation? Well, if you read about what was going on, there were negotiations and there was a deal on the table where Gaddafi was going to step aside. We could have, through that negotiation, ensured that Saif came to power and was allowed to pursue his liberal agenda. So the last question then is, what are the lessons from Libya for the future of U.S. foreign policy? Some, including on this panel, including our host, might say the lesson is don't intervene abroad. I think that sort of prescription throws the baby out with the bathwater, because some interventions help a lot. I've documented, for example, in Liberia in 2003, how our intervention helped end a civil war, end the killing of thousands. Moreover, failing to intervene in a timely manner can allow things to get much worse. Indeed, aside from Libya, I would say this has been President Obama's main approach, what some people call leading from behind. Just basically, well, let's let things simmer. Let's let others try and work it out. And what generally happens is that no one actually takes the lead and takes care of the problem. It's what's known as a collective action problem. You need the biggest power on the planet to take the lead if you want for there to be that sort of collective action. And so instead we get no action, and we create a vacuum. And who comes into that vacuum? Generally bad actors, such as ISIS. And so we saw that in Iraq, when President Obama decided not to take early action. What happens is there was a vacuum created. ISIS came to control large swaths of territory, and now it's going to take much greater action at much greater cost to deal with the situation. So finally, what are the lessons of Libya for intervening better in the future? I would say there are three, and I'll conclude on these. First of all, beware propaganda. Rebels around the world have an interest in convincing us in the United States that they are more unified and the regime they oppose is more evil than is actually the case. They want us to be their army, and they want us to be their air force, and like Pete Townsend wrote, we should not get fooled again. Secondly, don't let humanitarian concerns overshadow the national interest. Humanitarianism is a worthwhile cause. I've written 2 books about it because I think it is a worthwhile cause. However, nuclear nonproliferation and terrorism are more important. And so if it comes that one is in conflict with the other, we need to take care of our interests first. And then lastly, there is the issue of the moral hazard of humanitarian intervention. And that's you can read my work on that. The take-home point of that is that if a country is narrowly targeting militants in response to rebellion, we should not intervene on humanitarian grounds. And the reason is our intervention in that sort of case will likely escalate violence from both sides, the government and the rebels, and thereby exacerbate the humanitarian suffering. It only makes sense to intervene on humanitarian grounds if a country is actually targeting civilians, which is not what was happening in Libya. Thanks.
Great, thank you.